Sarah Chen walked into the music classroom 10 minutes before class started. She always came early to find a seat in the back row where nobody would notice her. The room smelled like old wood and dust from the piano that sat in the corner. Other students were already talking loudly about their weekend plans and complaining about homework. She pulled out her notebook and a pencil that was almost too short to write with. The notebook had seen better days. Its cover was torn and the pages were yellow around the edges. Sarah had bought it from the discount bin at the campus bookstore because she could not afford the new ones. Her classmates looked different from her. Most of them wore expensive clothes and carried brand new backpacks. They talked about concerts they had been to and music lessons they took when they were kids. Sarah listened but never joined their conversations. She felt like she did not belong in their world. Professor Martinez walked into the room carrying a stack of papers. He was a tall man with gray hair who always wore the same brown jacket. Students said he was tough but fair. He looked around the room with serious eyes before speaking. "Good morning, everyone. Today we will talk about your final project for this semester." The room became quiet. Sarah felt her stomach twist with worry. Final projects always meant spending money she did not have on materials or equipment. "You will each perform a piano piece at our end-of-semester recital," Professor Martinez continued. "This will count for 30% of your final grade." A girl named Jessica raised her hand. "Can we choose our own pieces?" "No," the professor said firmly. "I will assign each piece based on what I think will challenge you properly." Sarah felt her heart beat faster. She had not played piano in front of people for years. The last time was at a small competition when she was 15. That felt like a lifetime ago. Professor Martinez started calling out names and assigning pieces. Sarah noticed that the students who seemed confident got easier songs. The ones who struggled in class got harder ones. She wondered what that meant for her. "Jennifer, you will play Mozart's Sonata in C major," he said to a blonde girl in the front row who always answered questions correctly. "Michael, Bach's Invention No. 1 in C major," he told a boy who played guitar in a local band. Sarah's name was not called for a long time. She watched other students write down their assignments. Some looked happy. Others looked worried. She tried to stay calm, but her hands were shaking slightly. Finally, Professor Martinez looked directly at her. "Sarah Chen." She sat up straighter in her chair. The room felt very quiet, even though other students were still whispering to each other. "You will perform Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor." Sarah felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. She knew that piece. It was one of the most difficult piano compositions ever written. Even professional pianists found it challenging. She had heard it performed only a few times, and each time it had taken her breath away. "Professor," said a boy named David, who sat near the front, "isn't that piece really hard?" Professor Martinez nodded. "Yes, it is quite challenging. But I believe Sarah needs something that will push her to work harder." Sarah felt her face turn red. She knew what he really meant. He thought she was not good enough for this class. He was giving her an impossible task, hoping she would drop out or transfer to an easier program. After class, Sarah walked slowly to her job at the campus cafeteria. She worked there 20 hours a week, washing dishes and cleaning tables. The money helped pay for her classes and books. Without this job, she could not stay in school. Her friend Maria noticed she looked upset. Maria was from Mexico and worked in the kitchen making sandwiches. She was always kind to Sarah and sometimes saved her extra food when the cafeteria was closing. "What's wrong?" Maria asked during their break. "You look like someone stole your favorite book." Sarah told her about the piano assignment. She explained how hard the piece was and how she felt like the professor was trying to make her fail. "Maybe he sees something in you that you don't see in yourself," Maria suggested. "Teachers don't always give hard work to students they want to fail. Sometimes they give it to students they think can handle it." Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand. This piece is impossible. I would need months to learn it, and we only have 3 weeks. Have you played piano before?" Maria asked. Sarah paused. She had never told anyone at school about her musical background. It felt like opening a door she had kept locked for years. "A little bit when I was younger," she said quietly, "but not anything like this." That evening, Sarah walked home to the small apartment she shared with her grandmother. The building was old and the hallway always smelled like cooking and cleaning products. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor and the elevator had been broken for 2 months. Her grandmother was watching television when Sarah came in. Grandma Chen was 83 years old and used a wheelchair to move around. Her hands were bent from arthritis, but her mind was still sharp. She spoke English with a heavy accent because she had moved to America from China 40 years ago. "How was school today?" her grandmother asked in Chinese. Sarah answered in the same language. They always spoke Chinese at home. "My music professor gave me a very hard piece to play for my final project." Her grandmother's eyes became interested. "What piece?" "Chopin's Ballade No. 1. For a moment, her grandmother's face changed. Sarah saw something flash in her eyes, surprise, maybe even excitement. But it disappeared quickly. "That is a beautiful piece," her grandmother said carefully. "Very challenging." Sarah sat down on the old couch next to her grandmother's wheelchair. "I don't think I can do it, Grandma. It's too hard, and I haven't practiced seriously in years." Her grandmother was quiet for a long time. She looked toward the corner of the living room, where an old upright piano sat covered with a white sheet. Nobody had played it in months. "Sometimes," her grandmother said slowly, "the hardest challenges bring out abilities we forgot we had." Sarah followed her grandmother's gaze to the covered piano. She remembered the countless hours she had spent at those keys when she was younger. The memory made her chest feel tight with sadness and longing. That night, Sarah lay in bed thinking about the assignment. 3 weeks to learn one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written. Her professor clearly thought she would fail. Maybe he was right. Maybe she should ask for a different piece or drop the class entirely. But something inside her felt different. For the first time in years, she was thinking about music not as something she had lost, but as something that might still be waiting for her. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the music building early. She wanted to find the sheet music for Chopin's Ballade No. 1 before other students arrived. The music library was on the second floor, and it was always quiet there. She climbed the stairs slowly, thinking about what her grandmother had said the night before. The words kept playing in her mind like a song she could not forget. The librarian, Mrs. Peterson, was a friendly woman who knew every piece of music in the building. She had gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and always wore reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. "Good morning, Sarah," Mrs. Peterson said with a smile. "You're here early today." "I need to find sheet music for Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor," Sarah said quietly. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows went up. "That's quite an ambitious piece. Is this for Professor Martinez's class?" Sarah nodded, feeling embarrassed. She was sure Mrs. Peterson was thinking the same thing as everyone else, that this piece was too hard for her. Mrs. Peterson walked to a tall shelf and pulled out a thick book of Chopin's works. She found the right page and showed it to Sarah. The music looked like a puzzle made of black dots and lines. There were so many notes packed together that Sarah's eyes felt tired just looking at it. "This piece tells a story," Mrs. Peterson explained. "Chopin wrote it when he was feeling homesick for Poland. It starts gentle and sad, then becomes angry and powerful, then sad again. It's like reading someone's diary written in music." Sarah stared at the first page. Even she could see how complex it was. Her hands would need to move in ways that seemed impossible. Some parts had so many notes that it looked like both hands would be doing completely different things at the same time. "How long does it usually take to learn this?" Sarah asked. Mrs. Peterson thought for a moment. "For a student at your level? Most would need at least 6 months of daily practice. Some need longer." Sarah's heart sank. She had 3 weeks. "But," Mrs. Peterson continued, "some students have natural gifts that help them learn faster. You never know what you can do until you try." Sarah checked out the music book and walked to her first class of the day. During the whole lecture about American history, she kept thinking about the piano piece. She drew little musical notes in the margins of her notebook without realizing it. At lunch, she sat alone at a small table in the corner of the cafeteria. She opened the music book and studied the first page while eating a sandwich. The notes seemed to dance in front of her eyes. 2 of her classmates from music theory walked by her table. Their names were Ashley and Brandon, and they always sat in the front row of Professor Martinez's class. "Look," Ashley whispered to Brandon, but not quietly enough. "Sarah's looking at Chopin. Do you think she knows how impossible that piece is?" Brandon shook his head. "Professor Martinez must really want her to drop the class. Nobody assigns that piece to a beginner." "I heard from my friend who took his class last year," Ashley continued, "that he only gives the hardest pieces to students he thinks won't make it. It's his way of making them quit without actually telling them to quit." Sarah felt her face turn hot. She closed the music book and tried to focus on her sandwich, but she had lost her appetite. The bread felt like cardboard in her mouth. After they walked away, Sarah sat alone with their words echoing in her head. Maybe they were right. Maybe Professor Martinez was trying to make her fail, but why would he do that? She had never caused trouble in class. She always did her homework and showed up on time. That afternoon, Sarah had to work an extra shift at the cafeteria because another student had called in sick. She spent 4 hours washing dishes and wiping down tables. Her hands were red and sore from the hot water and cleaning chemicals. While she worked, she kept thinking about the piano piece. She tried to remember the melody from the time she had heard it performed. Parts of it came back to her, floating through her memory like old photographs. When her shift ended, Sarah walked across campus to the music building. She had never been inside the practice rooms before. Students needed to reserve them, and she had always assumed they were for advanced players only. She found Professor Martinez in his office. The door was open, and he was grading papers with a red pen. His desk was covered with sheet music and coffee cups. "Sarah," he said, looking up when she knocked on the door frame. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to ask about the piece you assigned me," she said, stepping into the office. "Chopin's Ballad No. 1. Professor Martinez leaned back in his chair. "What about it?" "It seems very difficult. I was wondering if maybe there was a different piece that might be more appropriate for my skill level." Professor Martinez studied her face for a long moment. "Sarah, I don't give assignments randomly. I chose this piece specifically for you." "But why?" Sarah asked. "I'm not the best student in the class. I sit in the back and I never answer questions." "That's exactly why," Professor Martinez said. "You sit quietly and listen, but I can tell you understand more than you let on. When you do speak, your answers show real musical insight. I think you're capable of more than you realize." Sarah felt confused. This was not what she had expected him to say. "But 3 weeks isn't enough time to learn a piece like this," she said, "isn't it?" Professor Martinez asked. "How do you know unless you try?" "I've been teaching for 20 years, Sarah. I can usually tell which students have hidden potential. You might surprise yourself." Sarah left his office feeling more confused than before. Part of her felt hopeful that maybe he really did believe in her. But another part worried that he was just being polite and still expected her to fail. She walked home slowly, taking a longer route that went past the park. It was getting dark and the streetlights were starting to come on. Other students were heading to dinner or back to their dorms, but Sarah felt like she was walking through a different world. When she got to her apartment, her grandmother was in the kitchen making tea. The smell of jasmine filled the small room. "How was your day?" her grandmother asked in Chinese. Sarah told her about her conversation with Professor Martinez. She also mentioned what her classmates had said about the professor giving hard pieces to students he wanted to fail. Her grandmother poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Sarah. "What do you think? Do you believe your professor wants you to fail?" Sarah thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe he really does think I can do it. But what if I can't? What if I embarrass myself in front of the whole class?" Her grandmother smiled. "Embarrassment is temporary. Regret lasts much longer." They sat together drinking tea in comfortable silence. Sarah looked again at the covered piano in the corner of the living room. She had not touched those keys in over a year. "Grandma," she said finally, "do you think I should try to learn the piece?" Her grandmother's eyes became soft. "I think you should follow your heart. But remember, some doors can only be opened from the inside." That night, Sarah lay in bed holding the sheet music. She had memorized the first few measures just from looking at them. The melody was beautiful and sad, just like Mrs. Peterson had said. It reminded her of feelings she had buried deep inside herself. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine her fingers moving across the piano keys. In her mind, she could hear how the piece should sound. But could her hands actually play what her mind could hear? Tomorrow, she decided, she would find out. Tomorrow, she would uncover the piano and see if her grandmother was right about abilities waiting to be rediscovered. For the first time in months, Sarah fell asleep thinking about music instead of worrying about money or grades or fitting in. And in her dreams, she heard the most beautiful piano music she had ever imagined. Sarah woke up before her alarm clock rang. Sunlight was just starting to come through the thin curtains of her bedroom. She had been dreaming about piano music again, and the melody was still playing in her head. She got dressed quietly so she would not wake her grandmother. In the kitchen, she made instant coffee and toast with peanut butter. While she ate, she kept looking toward the living room where the piano sat under its white sheet. For months, that piano had been like a sleeping giant in their small apartment. Nobody talked about it and nobody played it. But today felt different. Today, Sarah could not stop thinking about what was hiding under that sheet. Her grandmother usually slept late because her arthritis hurt worse in the mornings. But when Sarah was getting ready to leave for school, she heard the sound of her grandmother's wheelchair moving across the floor. "You're up early," her grandmother said, rolling into the kitchen. "I couldn't sleep," Sarah replied. "I kept thinking about the piano piece." Her grandmother nodded slowly. "That piece has a way of staying in your mind." Something in her grandmother's voice made Sarah look at her more carefully. "Grandma, you know this piece, don't you?" Her grandmother's hands, twisted with arthritis, rested on the arms of her wheelchair. For a moment, she looked much younger, like she was remembering something from long ago. "I know it very well," she said quietly. "I used to play it." Sarah felt surprised. She knew her grandmother had played piano in China, but she had never heard her play anything that difficult. "When?" Sarah asked. "Many years ago, before you were born. Before I came to America." Her grandmother's voice became soft and distant. "I was a concert pianist in Shanghai. Chopin was one of my specialties." Sarah sat down at the kitchen table. This was more than her grandmother had ever told her about her life in China. "You were a concert pianist?" Sarah asked. "Like a real professional musician?" Her grandmother smiled sadly. "Yes, for 10 years. I played in concert halls and with orchestras. I recorded albums and gave recitals all over China. Music was my whole life." "What happened? Why did you stop?" Her grandmother was quiet for a long time. She looked toward the living room where the piano waited under its cover. "Life happened," she said finally. "When I came to America, nobody cared that I had been a famous pianist in China. Here I was just another immigrant who could not speak English well. I worked in restaurants and cleaned office buildings. There was no time for music." Sarah felt a heavy sadness in her chest. She tried to imagine her grandmother as a young woman playing beautiful music for audiences who came just to hear her perform. "Is that why you taught me to play when I was little?" Sarah asked. "Yes," her grandmother said. "I wanted to give you the gift that life had taken away from me. When I heard you play, I knew you had something special. You understood music in a way that cannot be taught." Sarah remembered those early lessons. She had been only 4 years old when her grandmother first put her small hands on the piano keys. By the time she was 7, she was playing pieces that amazed her elementary school teachers. "Why did we stop the lessons?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Her grandmother's face became sadder. "Money. When your grandfather got sick, we needed every dollar for his medical treatments. Piano lessons became a luxury we could not afford. I thought it would be temporary, but then he died and you started working to help with expenses and somehow the music just disappeared." Sarah remembered those difficult years. She had been 15 when her grandfather died. The family had struggled to pay for his cancer treatments, and afterward, they could barely afford rent and food. Sarah had started working part-time jobs to help her grandmother. Piano had seemed like something that belonged to her childhood, not to the serious business of survival. "I'm sorry, Grandma," Sarah said. "I should have kept practicing on my own." Her grandmother reached across the table and touched Sarah's hand with her bent fingers. "No, my dear. You were being responsible. But now maybe it's time to see if the music is still there." After breakfast, Sarah walked to school thinking about everything her grandmother had told her. She felt like she was seeing her family's history from a completely new angle. Her grandmother had not just been a woman who played piano for fun. She had been an artist, a professional musician whose career had been interrupted by the challenges of immigrant life. In her first class, Sarah could not concentrate. Her professor was talking about psychology, but Sarah's mind was full of images of her grandmother performing on concert stages in China. She tried to imagine what it must have felt like to give up such a successful career and start over in a new country. During lunch, Sarah found herself in the music library again. This time she was not looking for her assignment. She was looking for recordings of Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Mrs. Peterson helped her find a collection of classic piano recordings. They went to a small listening room with headphones and a CD player. "This recording is by Martha Argerich," Mrs. Peterson explained. "She's considered one of the greatest living pianists. Her interpretation of this piece is famous." Sarah put on the headphones and pressed play. The first notes were gentle and questioning, like someone walking into an empty room and calling out to see if anyone was there. Then the melody became more urgent, more emotional. Sarah could hear the story Mrs. Peterson had mentioned, the homesickness, the anger, the sadness. But more than that, Sarah could hear something familiar in the music. It reminded her of how her grandmother used to play, with deep feeling and perfect technique combined. She wondered if her grandmother had ever played this piece the way Martha Argerich was playing it now. After her classes ended, Sarah went to work at the cafeteria. But instead of feeling tired and distracted like usual, she felt energized. The music from the recording was still playing in her head, and her fingers kept moving on imaginary piano keys while she washed dishes. Maria noticed that Sarah seemed different. "You look happier today," she said during their break. "Did something good happen?" Sarah told her about learning that her grandmother had been a professional pianist. She explained how it made her see her own musical background in a new way. "So you really can play piano," Maria said. "You weren't just being modest yesterday." Sarah thought about how to answer. "I used to play, but it's been a long time. I don't know if I still can." "Only one way to find out," Maria said with a smile. When Sarah got home that evening, her grandmother was sitting in the living room watching the news, but Sarah noticed that she had moved her wheelchair closer to the piano. "Grandma," Sarah said, "will you help me with something?" Her grandmother turned off the television. "Of course." Together they removed the white sheet from the piano. Underneath was a beautiful old upright piano with dark wood that gleamed even in the dim light. Sarah had forgotten how elegant it looked. Her grandmother rolled her wheelchair close to the piano bench. "Sit down," she said gently. Sarah sat on the bench and looked at the keys. They seemed to glow in the lamplight. She had not sat here in over a year. "Put your hands on the keys," her grandmother instructed. "Don't play anything yet. Just remember what it feels like." Sarah placed her hands in the correct position. Her fingers found their natural curve automatically. It felt like coming home after a long trip. "Now," her grandmother said, "play me a scale. Start with C major." Sarah pressed the keys slowly. The sound filled their small apartment like warm light. Each note was clear and true. Her fingers remembered exactly how much pressure to use and how to move smoothly from one note to the next. "Good," her grandmother said with satisfaction. "Your technique is still there. Now try D major." For the next hour, Sarah played scales and simple exercises while her grandmother watched and occasionally offered gentle corrections. Sarah's hands felt a little stiff at first, but gradually, they became more flexible and confident. "Enough for tonight," her grandmother said finally. "Tomorrow we will start working on your assignment." Sarah looked at her grandmother in surprise. "You want to help me learn the Chopin piece?" Her grandmother's eyes were bright with something Sarah had not seen there in years. "I may not be able to play anymore," she said, holding up her arthritis-bent hands, "but I can still teach. And this piece I know by heart." That night, Sarah fell asleep with her hands under her pillow, her fingers still tingling from touching the piano keys. In her dreams, she was a little girl again, sitting next to her grandmother at the piano, learning that music was not just sound but a language that could express feelings too deep for words. The next evening, Sarah could hardly wait to get home from work. Her shift at the cafeteria had felt longer than usual. Every time she wiped down a table or loaded dishes into the washing machine, she was thinking about the piano waiting for her at home. When she walked into their apartment, her grandmother was already sitting by the piano with the sheet music spread out on the music stand. "Are you ready to begin?" her grandmother asked. Sarah sat down on the piano bench and looked at the first page of Chopin's Ballade No. 1. The notes looked less frightening than they had a few days ago, but still very challenging. "First," her grandmother said, "you must understand what this piece is about. Chopin wrote it in 1835 when he was living in Paris but missing his home in Poland. The music tells the story of someone remembering their homeland." Her grandmother's voice became soft and thoughtful. "The beginning is like a person walking alone thinking about home. The middle section is like a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, longing. Then it becomes quiet again, but sadder than before." Sarah nodded. She could hear those emotions in her memory of the recording she had listened to. "Now," her grandmother continued, "let's start with just the first 4 measures. Play them very slowly." Sarah placed her hands on the keys and began. The melody was simple but beautiful, rising and falling like someone speaking in a gentle voice. Her grandmother listened carefully, occasionally stopping her to correct a fingering or suggest a different way to phrase a musical line. After an hour of working on just those 4 measures, Sarah felt frustrated. At this pace, it would take months to learn the whole piece. "Grandma," she said, "this is too slow. I only have 2.5 weeks left." Her grandmother smiled patiently. "Learning music is like building a house. If you rush the foundation, the whole building will fall down. These first measures are your foundation." They practiced for another hour before her grandmother said it was time to stop. Sarah's fingers were getting tired and she was making more mistakes. "Tomorrow we will continue," her grandmother said. "But tonight you should rest your hands." Sarah lay in bed that night feeling both excited and worried. The music was beautiful, and she loved working with her grandmother again. But she was afraid that 2 weeks would not be enough time to learn such a difficult piece well enough to perform it. The next day at school, Sarah found herself distracted during all her classes. She kept thinking about the piano piece and wishing she could practice more. During her music theory class, Professor Martinez talked about different composers and their styles. When he mentioned Chopin, Sarah felt her face turn red, like everyone could tell she was thinking about her secret practicing. After classes ended, Sarah had an idea. Instead of going straight to work, she walked to the music building. She had seen other students going in and out of practice rooms, and she wondered if she could use one. The practice rooms were on the first floor of the music building. There were 12 small rooms, each with a piano and a music stand. Sarah looked through the windows of several rooms and saw students inside practicing. Some were playing classical pieces. Others were working on jazz or popular songs. Sarah found the secretary's office and knocked on the door. A kind-looking woman with curly hair answered. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. "I'm in Professor Martinez's music theory class," Sarah explained. "I was wondering if I could reserve a practice room to work on my recital piece." The secretary, whose nameplate said Mrs. Rodriguez, smiled. "Of course. That's what they're for. How long do you need?" Sarah was not sure what was normal. "Maybe an hour?" Mrs. Rodriguez looked at a schedule on her computer. "I can give you practice room C from 3 to 4 in this afternoon. Will that work?" Sarah nodded, feeling excited. She had never had access to a real piano practice room before. At 3:00, Sarah unlocked practice room C with the key Mrs. Rodriguez had given her. The room was small but comfortable, with good lighting and a beautiful upright piano that was much newer than the one at home. She spread out her sheet music and began practicing the measures her grandmother had taught her. In the quiet practice room, she could hear every note clearly. She worked on getting the fingering right and tried to play with the emotional expression her grandmother had described. After an hour, Sarah felt like she had made real progress. The first page of the piece was starting to feel comfortable under her fingers. Over the next few days, Sarah fell into a routine. She would attend classes, work her shift at the cafeteria, practice at home with her grandmother for an hour or two, then sign up for practice room time whenever it was available. But soon Sarah realized that other students were also trying to reserve practice rooms, especially as the recital date got closer. Sometimes all the rooms were taken, and sometimes she could only get 30 minutes instead of an hour. One evening, Sarah was walking past the music building after her late shift at the cafeteria. When she noticed that the lights were still on, she wondered if any practice rooms might be available. She tried the main door and found it was unlocked. The hallway was empty and quiet. Sarah walked down to the practice rooms and saw that they were all dark and empty. She tried the door of practice room C and found it was open. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Sarah went inside and turned on the light. The building felt different at night. It was completely quiet except for the sound of her footsteps and the creaking of old floors. Sarah sat down at the piano and began to practice. Without other students around, without time limits, without feeling like she had to hurry, Sarah found herself playing better than she ever had. She worked on the first movement of the ballad for 2 hours, repeating difficult passages until they became smooth and natural. When she finally looked at her watch, it was almost midnight. Sarah was surprised to realize how much time had passed. She packed up her music and left the building quietly, making sure to turn off the lights and lock the practice room door. The next night, Sarah came back again. This time, she brought a small flashlight so she could walk through the dark hallways without turning on all the main lights. She did not want to attract attention from security guards or janitors, Practice Room C became her secret sanctuary. Every night after work, Sarah would slip into the music building and practice for hours. She made friends with Mr. Jackson, the night janitor, who saw her leaving one evening and asked what she was doing. "Just practicing for a recital," Sarah explained, worried that she might get in trouble. Mr. Jackson was an older black man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "That's good," he said. "Music is important. You just be careful walking around here so late at night. And make sure you lock up when you leave." From then on, Mr. Jackson would sometimes stop by Practice Room C to check on Sarah. He never stayed long, but sometimes he would listen from the hallway and nod approvingly at what he heard. "You're getting better," he told her one night. "When I first heard you a week ago, I could tell you had talent. But now you're starting to make that piano sing." Sarah began to look forward to these late-night practice sessions more than anything else in her day. In the quiet, dimly lit practice room, she felt like she could finally be herself. She did not have to worry about what other students thought or whether she looked like she belonged. The music was becoming part of her again. Her fingers were remembering not just how to play the notes, but how to make them express emotions. The sad parts of the ballade made her think about missing home, even though she had never lived anywhere but this city. The angry parts reminded her of frustrations she had felt, but never been able to put into words. At home, her grandmother was amazed at how quickly Sarah was improving. "You've been practicing more than just what we do together," her grandmother observed one evening. Sarah told her about the practice rooms and her late-night sessions. She was worried her grandmother might think she was being irresponsible, staying up so late when she had to work and attend classes. But her grandmother smiled proudly. "Music is calling to you again," she said. "When that happens, you must answer. I used to practice until very late when I was preparing for important concerts. There's something special about making music when the rest of the world is sleeping." By the end of the second week, Sarah had learned the entire first movement of the ballade. It was not perfect yet, but it was recognizable and musical. Her grandmother helped her understand the structure of the piece and the way different themes appeared and developed throughout the movement. "Now comes the hard part," her grandmother warned. "The second movement is much more technically difficult. But you're ready for it?" Sarah felt both excited and nervous. She had come further than she had thought possible, but she still had a long way to go. The recital was now only 1 week away, and she still had to learn the most challenging parts of the piece. But every night in Practice Room C, under the soft glow of the desk lamp with only the piano and the music for company, Sarah felt like she was discovering something important about herself. She was not just learning to play a difficult piece. She was remembering who she really was. With only 1 week left before the recital, Sarah felt like she was living 2 different lives. During the day, she was still the quiet student who sat in the back of the classroom and never spoke unless asked a direct question. But at night, in Practice Room C, she was becoming someone else entirely. The second movement of Chopin's ballad was proving to be as difficult as her grandmother had warned. Sarah's hands had to move in complex patterns that seemed impossible at first. Some passages required her left hand to play a steady bass line, while her right hand played rapid, flowing melodies that jumped all over the keyboard. "This is like trying to pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time," Sarah complained to her grandmother during one of their evening practice sessions at home. Her grandmother laughed. "Exactly. That's why this piece separates good pianists from great ones. Your brain has to learn to control your hands independently, like they belong to 2 different people." Sarah was making progress, but slowly. Every night she stayed in the practice room until well past midnight, working on small sections over and over again. Sometimes she felt like she was getting better. Other times the music seemed to fall apart under her fingers. During the day at school, Sarah tried to act normal. She did not want anyone to know how much time she was spending on the piano piece. When her classmates talked about their recital preparations, Sarah mostly listened. "I've been practicing my Mozart piece for an hour every day," said Jennifer, the blonde girl who always seemed confident about everything. "It's pretty easy once you get the hand positions right." "My Bach invention is coming along well," added Michael, the boy who played guitar. "I should have it memorized by tomorrow." Sarah noticed that most of her classmates had been assigned pieces that were much shorter and simpler than hers. Their pieces were beautiful, but they could be learned in a few weeks without too much difficulty. During music theory class, Professor Martinez started spending more time talking about performance techniques and dealing with nervousness. He gave advice about memorizing music and what to do if you made a mistake during a performance. Remember, he told the class, the audience wants you to succeed. They're not sitting there hoping you'll mess up. If you make a small mistake, just keep going. Most people won't even notice. Sarah wondered if that would be true for her piece. If she made a mistake in Chopin's ballad, would it be small enough for people to miss? Or would it be obvious to everyone that she was in over her head? One afternoon, Professor Martinez asked Sarah to stay after class for a few minutes. "How is your preparation going?" he asked when the other students had left. Sarah felt nervous. She did not know how much to tell him. "It's going okay," she said carefully. "I hope you know that I assigned you this piece because I believe you can handle it," Professor Martinez said. "But I also want you to understand that if you're struggling, we can discuss alternatives. There's no shame in choosing a different piece if this one proves to be too ambitious." Sarah felt a mix of emotions. Part of her was tempted to take the easy way out. She could ask for a simpler piece and probably do well with it. But another part of her felt like that would be giving up on something important. "I want to try to do the Chopin," she said finally. Professor Martinez nodded. "Good. But remember, the most important thing is that you perform something you can play well, not that you attempt something that's beyond your current abilities." After he said this, Sarah felt more pressure than before. What if she was kidding herself? What if she was working so hard on a piece that she would never be able to perform properly? That evening, Sarah arrived at practice room C feeling discouraged. She sat down at the piano and tried to play through the entire first movement of the ballade. It went fairly well until she got to a particularly difficult section near the end where her left hand had to play rapid octaves, while her right hand played a delicate melody. Her hands got tangled up, and the music fell apart completely. Sarah stopped playing and put her head in her hands. Maybe Professor Martinez was right. Maybe she should choose something easier. She was sitting there feeling sorry for herself when she heard a gentle knock on the practice room door. Sarah looked up to see Mr. Jackson, the night janitor, standing in the doorway. "Everything okay in here?" he asked kindly. "I heard the music stop suddenly," Sarah sighed. "I'm not sure I can learn this piece in time for the recital. It might be too hard for me." Mr. Jackson came into the room and sat down on the small chair by the music stand. "Can I tell you something?" he said. Sarah nodded. "I've been listening to you practice for 2 weeks now," Mr. Jackson said. "When you first started coming here, you sounded like someone who was trying to remember how to ride a bicycle. But now you sound like a real musician." "But I keep making mistakes," Sarah said. "Of course you do," Mr. Jackson replied. "You think professional musicians never make mistakes when they're learning new pieces? The difference is, they don't give up when things get difficult." He stood up to leave, then turned back to Sarah. "You know what I hear when you play that piece? I hear someone telling a story that means something to them. That's not something you can fake, and it's not something everyone can do." After Mr. Jackson left, Sarah sat quietly for a few minutes thinking about what he had said. She looked at the sheet music spread out on the piano. All those black notes that had seemed so impossible a few weeks ago now felt familiar. Like words in a language she was remembering how to speak. Sarah started playing again, this time focusing not on the notes she was getting wrong, but on the story the music was telling. She thought about her grandmother's description of Chopin missing his homeland. She thought about her own family's journey from China to America, and the sacrifices her grandmother had made. As she played, Sarah began to understand something important. The difficult technical passages were not just obstacles to overcome. They were part of the emotional expression of the piece. The rapid octaves in her left hand represented urgency and excitement. The delicate melody in her right hand was like someone calling out across a great distance. When she stopped playing an hour later, Sarah realized that she had played through the difficult section several times without major mistakes. She had not been thinking about finger positions or hand coordination. She had been thinking about the story, and her hands had followed naturally. The next day in music theory class, Professor Martinez was talking about musical interpretation and expression. "Technical accuracy is important," he said, "but what really matters is whether you can communicate the composer's intentions to your audience." He looked around the room. "Can anyone give me an example of what I mean?" For the first time all semester, Sarah raised her hand. Professor Martinez looked surprised but pleased. "When you play a sad piece," and Sarah said, "it's not enough to just play the right notes. You have to make the audience feel the sadness too." Exactly, Professor Martinez said with enthusiasm. The notes on the page are just the beginning. The real music happens when you bring your own understanding and emotion to those notes. Sarah felt a warm glow of satisfaction. For once, she had contributed something meaningful to the class discussion. After class, several of her classmates approached her. "I didn't know you knew so much about music interpretation," said Ashley, the girl who had whispered about Sarah's assignment a few weeks earlier. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately," Sarah replied. "What piece are you playing for the recital again?" asked Brandon. "Chopin's Ballad No. 1, Sarah said. Brandon's eyes widened. "Wow, that's really ambitious." "I heard that piece is incredibly difficult." Sarah smiled. "It is, but I'm learning that sometimes the most difficult things are also the most rewarding." That night, Sarah practiced with more confidence than she had felt in days. She was no longer just trying to play the notes correctly. She was trying to tell Chopin's story and her own story through the music. Her grandmother noticed the difference immediately when Sarah practiced at home the next evening. "Something has changed," her grandmother observed. "You're not fighting the music anymore. You're dancing with it," Sarah nodded. "I think I'm finally understanding what this piece is really about." "And what is that?" her grandmother asked. Sarah thought for a moment. "It's about finding your way home even when home is not a place you can actually go back to." Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears. "Yes," she whispered. "That's exactly what it's about." With only 3 days left before the recital, Sarah finally felt ready to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Not perfectly. She knew she would probably make some mistakes. But she felt ready to tell its story, and to share a part of herself that she had kept hidden for too long. The morning of the recital, Sarah woke up with butterflies dancing in her stomach. She had barely slept. And when she did sleep, she had dreamed about forgetting the music in the middle of her performance. She looked at her hands in the morning light. They looked the same as always, but today they would have to do something that felt almost impossible. In just a few hours, these hands would need to play one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written. In front of her classmates, her professor, and anyone else who wanted to attend the student recital. Her grandmother was already awake, sitting in her wheelchair by the kitchen table with a cup of tea. "How do you feel?" her grandmother asked in Chinese. "Terrified," Sarah answered honestly, also in Chinese. Her grandmother smiled. "Good. That means you care about doing well. The day I stopped feeling nervous before performances was the day I knew my career was ending." Sarah made herself eat breakfast, even though she did not feel hungry. She knew she would need energy for the performance that evening. "Grandma," Sarah said, "what if I forget the music? What if I make terrible mistakes?" Her grandmother reached across the table and took Sarah's hands in her bent, arthritis-damaged fingers. "Listen to me carefully," she said. "You have practiced this piece until it lives in your muscle memory. Your hands know what to do even if your brain becomes nervous. Trust your preparation." Sarah spent the morning trying to distract herself. She did laundry, cleaned the apartment, and tried to read a book for one of her other classes. But her mind kept wandering back to the piano piece. In the afternoon, she decided to go to campus early. The recital was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the small concert hall in the music building. Sarah wanted to see the performance space and maybe practice one more time. The concert hall was bigger than she had expected. It had about 150 seats arranged in rows facing a small stage with a beautiful black grand piano. Sarah had never played on a grand piano before. She was used to the upright piano at home and the smaller upright pianos in the practice rooms. Mrs. Rodriguez, the secretary, was in the hall checking that everything was ready for the evening performance. "Hello, Sarah," she said warmly. "Are you excited about tonight?" "More nervous than excited," Sarah admitted. "That's completely normal," Mrs. Rodriguez assured her. "Would you like to try out the piano? You're welcome to practice for a few minutes if it would help you feel more comfortable." Sarah nodded gratefully. She walked onto the stage and sat down at the grand piano. The bench was the right height, and the keys felt smooth and responsive under her fingers. She played a few scales to get used to the touch of the instrument. Grand pianos were more sensitive than upright pianos. They responded to the slightest changes in how hard or soft you pressed the keys. Then Sarah began to play the opening of Chopin's Ballade. The sound that came from the grand piano was richer and more beautiful than anything she had heard from the practice room pianos. Each note seemed to float in the air before fading away. "That's lovely," said a voice from the back of the hall. Sarah stopped playing and looked up to see Professor Martinez walking down the aisle toward the stage. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "I was just checking on the setup for tonight. How are you feeling about your performance?" Sarah's heart was beating fast. She had been so absorbed in the music that she had not heard him come in. "I'm nervous," she said, "but I think I'm ready." Professor Martinez climbed onto the stage and stood beside the piano. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Sarah felt confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Professor Martinez said carefully, "that what I just heard sounded like someone with years of serious training. Your technique, your musical interpretation, it's much more advanced than anything you've shown in class." Sarah felt her face turn red. She had been trying so hard to hide her abilities, but apparently she had not been successful. "My grandmother taught me when I was younger," she said quietly. "Your grandmother must be quite a teacher," Professor Martinez said. "What's her background?" Sarah hesitated. She had never told anyone at school about her grandmother's career as a concert pianist. It felt like revealing a family secret. "She used to be a professional musician," Sarah said finally, "in China before she came to America." Professor Martinez nodded slowly. "That explains a lot. Sarah, can I ask why you've been hiding your abilities? In class, you act like you barely know how to read music. But what I just heard suggests you're one of the most talented students I've ever taught." Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She had worked so hard to keep her two worlds separate. The world where she was just a struggling student trying to get by, and the world where music lived in her heart and her hands. "I didn't want people to have expectations," she said. "I didn't want to disappoint anyone if I couldn't live up to what they thought I could do." Professor Martinez sat down on the edge of the stage. "Sarah, talent like yours is a gift. Hiding it doesn't protect you from disappointment. It just prevents you from discovering what you're truly capable of." They talked for a few more minutes, and then Professor Martinez left Sarah alone to practice. She played through her piece 2 more times on the grand piano, getting used to how different it sounded and felt compared to the instruments she had been practicing on. By 6:30, people were starting to arrive for the recital. Sarah peeked out from backstage and saw students from her music theory class filing into seats. She also saw some faculty members and a few family members of other performers. Her heart jumped when she saw her grandmother being wheeled into the hall by Maria from the cafeteria. Sarah had not been sure if her grandmother would be able to come. Getting to the campus in her wheelchair was difficult, especially in the evening. The other student performers were gathering backstage. Jennifer looked confident and relaxed. Michael was warming up his fingers by playing silent scales on his legs. Ashley was reviewing her sheet music one last time. "Sarah," said Brandon when he saw her, "I heard you practicing earlier. You sound amazing. I had no idea you were so good." Before Sarah could respond, Professor Martinez called for everyone's attention. "It's time to begin," he announced. "Remember, tonight is about sharing your music with others. Try to enjoy the experience." The recital began with Jennifer playing her Mozart sonata. She performed well with clean technique and good timing. The audience applauded politely when she finished. Michael came next with his Bach invention. His performance was solid and musical, showing the influence of his guitar playing and his rhythmic precision. One by one, Sarah's classmates performed their pieces. Each performance was competent and pleasant. The audience seemed to enjoy the variety of music and the obvious preparation the students had put into their work. Finally, Professor Martinez announced, "Our final performer this evening is Sarah Chen, who will play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor." Sarah heard a few surprised murmurs from the audience. She knew that some people recognized the piece as being much more difficult than anything else that had been performed that evening. Sarah walked onto the stage wearing a simple black dress that Maria had lent her. The stage lights were brighter than she had expected, and for a moment she could not see the audience at all. She sat down at the piano and adjusted the bench. Her hands were shaking slightly, but when she placed them on the keys, they felt steady and ready. Sarah looked out into the audience one more time. She could see her grandmother in the front row, her eyes bright with pride and anticipation. This was the moment of truth. In the next few minutes, Sarah would either succeed in performing one of the most challenging pieces in the piano repertoire, or she would fail in front of everyone who mattered to her. She took a deep breath, placed her hands in position, and began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's ballade floated out into the concert hall, and Sarah felt everything else disappear. There was only the music, her hands, and the story she had learned to tell. As Sarah's fingers touched the keys for the opening measures of Chopin's ballade, something magical happened. All the nervousness that had been building up inside her for weeks suddenly disappeared. The concert hall, the audience, even her own fears seemed to fade away until there was nothing left but the music. The first theme emerged from the piano like a gentle conversation. Sarah's hands moved with confidence she had not felt since she was a child performing in local competitions. Each note was clear and purposeful, carrying the weight of Chopin's homesick longing for Poland. In the audience, Professor Martinez felt his jaw drop. This was not the hesitant student who had sat quietly in the back of his classroom for months. This was a mature, accomplished pianist who understood both the technical demands and emotional depths of one of the most challenging pieces in the repertoire. Sarah moved into the second theme, her left hand providing a steady, supportive foundation, while her right hand sang the melody with expressive warmth. She could feel the music flowing through her like water finding its natural course. Every phrase, every dynamic change, every subtle rubato felt as natural as breathing. Dr. Williams, the department head, had slipped into the back of the hall just as Sarah began playing. He had not planned to attend the student recital, but Professor Martinez had mentioned that one student was attempting an unusually ambitious piece. Now he stood frozen by the door, unable to believe what he was hearing. The other students in Sarah's class sat in stunned silence. Jennifer, who had felt confident about her Mozart performance just minutes earlier, now realized she was listening to playing that was on a completely different level. Michael stopped fingering his guitar chords and just listened, amazed by the technical control Sarah was displaying. Sarah reached the development section of the ballade, where Chopin's emotions become more turbulent and intense. Her hands moved in complex patterns across the keyboard, the left hand playing rapid octaves while the right hand wove intricate melodic lines above. This was the section she had struggled with most during her practice sessions, but now it flowed naturally as if her hands had always known these patterns. In the front row, Sarah's grandmother sat with tears streaming down her face. She recognized not just the notes her granddaughter was playing, but the musical maturity and emotional understanding that made those notes come alive. This was the gift she had tried to nurture when Sarah was young, the talent she had feared might be lost forever when the lessons stopped. Maria, who had helped bring Sarah's grandmother to the recital, watched in amazement. She had known Sarah was working on a difficult piece, but she had not imagined anything like this. The quiet, modest girl who washed dishes beside her in the cafeteria was transformed into someone commanding and confident, someone who could make a room full of people hold their breath. As Sarah moved through the most technically demanding passages of the piece, her concentration was complete. She was no longer thinking about finger positions or hand coordination. Instead, she was thinking about the story Chopin had embedded in the music, the pain of separation, the anger at circumstances beyond one's control, the bittersweet beauty of memories that could never become reality again. The recapitulation arrived, bringing back the opening theme but now colored by everything that had come before. Sarah played these familiar measures with deeper expression than she had found in them during practice. The music seemed to be teaching her new things about itself even as she performed it. Professor Martinez found himself leaning forward in his seat, completely absorbed. He had taught hundreds of students over his 20-year career, but he had never heard an undergraduate performance of this caliber. Sarah was not just playing the notes correctly, she was interpreting the piece with the kind of musical insight that usually took years to develop. Other faculty members who had wandered in to listen to the end of the student recital found themselves staying to hear the conclusion of Sarah's performance. Word was spreading quickly through the music building that something extraordinary was happening in the concert hall. The piece built toward its climactic section, where all of Chopin's themes combine in a passionate outpouring of emotion. Sarah's hands moved across the keyboard with power and grace, drawing sounds from the grand piano that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. The instrument responded to her touch like it was singing. As Sarah played, she thought about her grandmother's stories of performing in concert halls in Shanghai, about the sacrifices her family had made to come to America, about her own journey from a confident young pianist to a struggling student to whatever she was becoming now. All of these experiences seemed to flow through her fingers into the music. The final section of the ballade returned to the opening's contemplative mood, but now it carried the weight of everything that had come before. Sarah played these concluding measures with a maturity that surprised even her. The music seemed to be saying something about accepting loss while still honoring what had been beautiful. The last notes faded into silence, and for a moment, the concert hall remained completely quiet. Sarah sat at the piano with her hands still resting on the keys, hardly believing that she had just performed the entire piece without any major mistakes. Then the applause began. It started with her grandmother clapping with her bent hands. Then Professor Martinez stood up and began applauding more vigorously. Soon the entire audience was on their feet, applauding with an enthusiasm that went far beyond the polite appreciation they had shown for the earlier performances. Sarah stood up and took a bow, feeling dizzy with relief and exhilaration. The stage lights were bright, but she could see faces in the audience clearly now. Professor Martinez was shaking his head in amazement. Dr. Williams was applauding and saying something to the faculty member next to him. Her classmates looked shocked and impressed, but it was her grandmother's face that meant the most to Sarah. Through her tears, her grandmother was smiling with a joy that seemed to light up the entire front row. As Sarah walked off the stage, she felt like she was walking into a completely different life than the one she had woken up to that morning. Professor Martinez was waiting for her in the wings, along with several other faculty members she had never met. "Sarah," Professor Martinez said, his voice filled with excitement and something that might have been apology. "We need to talk. That was extraordinary." Dr. Williams stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Williams, the department head. I don't think we've been properly introduced." Sarah shook his hand, still feeling like she was in a dream. "Sarah," Dr. Williams continued, "I have to ask, have you ever considered applying to conservatory programs? With playing like that, you could have your choice of the top music schools in the country." Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, faculty members who had never noticed her before, classmates who were seeing her in a completely new light, and beyond them, her grandmother being wheeled toward the stage by Maria. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "Until a few weeks ago, I thought that part of my life was over." Professor Martinez put a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I assigned you that piece thinking it would be a good challenge for a struggling student. I had no idea I was asking someone with your abilities to prove herself with one of the most difficult pieces in the repertoire." "It's okay," Sarah said. "I needed to prove it to myself, too." As the other audience members filed out of the concert hall, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate her, ask her questions, and understand how someone with such obvious talent had been hiding in plain sight. But through it all, Sarah kept looking toward her grandmother, who was waiting patiently for the crowd to thin out so she could have her own moment with her granddaughter. When they finally reached each other, Sarah knelt down beside her grandmother's wheelchair. "I'm proud of you," her grandmother said in Chinese, her voice thick with emotion. "But more than that, I'm proud that you found your way back to yourself." Sarah hugged her grandmother, feeling like she was embracing not just the woman who had raised her, but all the dreams and possibilities that had seemed lost forever just a few hours ago. 3 days after the recital, Sarah sat in Professor Martinez's office, still trying to process everything that had happened. The small room was crowded with people: Professor Martinez, Dr. Williams, and Dr. Elizabeth Harper, a visiting professor from the prestigious Eastman School of Music, who had happened to be on campus for a conference. "Sarah," Dr. Williams began, "I want to start by saying that in my 15 years as department head, I have never heard an undergraduate performance like yours. What you did the other night was remarkable." Sarah felt overwhelmed. She was still the same person who worked in the cafeteria and worried about paying for textbooks, but suddenly everyone was treating her like she was someone special. Dr. Harper leaned forward in her chair. "I've spoken with my colleagues at Eastman, and based on what I heard at your recital, we would like to offer you a full scholarship for our master's program, starting in the fall." Sarah's mouth fell open. Eastman was one of the most respected music schools in the world. She had never even dreamed of applying there. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "How can you offer me a scholarship based on one performance?" "Because," Dr. Harper explained, "that one performance demonstrated technical skill, musical maturity, and artistic interpretation that most students don't achieve until their graduate years, if ever." You have a rare gift, Professor Martinez nodded. Sarah, I also want to offer you something. We have a teaching assistant position available for next semester. It would pay enough to cover your tuition here, plus a small salary. You could finish your undergraduate degree while getting experience teaching other students. Sarah felt dizzy. A week ago, she had been worried about failing music theory class. Now she was being offered opportunities she had never imagined possible. I need to think about this, Sarah said. And I need to talk to my grandmother. Dr. Williams smiled. Of course. These are big decisions. Take all the time you need. That evening, Sarah sat with her grandmother at their kitchen table, trying to explain everything that had happened in the professor's office. They want to give me a full scholarship to study music, Sarah said in Chinese, at one of the best schools in the country. Her grandmother was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the city lights. What do you want to do? Her grandmother finally asked. I don't know, Sarah admitted. A week ago, I thought music was just something from my childhood. Now people are telling me I could have a career as a pianist. And what does your heart tell you? Sarah thought about the feeling she had experienced during her performance. The sense of coming home to herself. Of expressing something that could not be said in words. My heart tells me I want to keep making music, she said. But I'm scared. What if I'm not as good as they think I am? What if I can't live up to their expectations? Her grandmother reached across the table and took Sarah's hands. Let me tell you something about expectations, she said. When I was young in China, everyone expected me to become a great pianist. The pressure was enormous. I felt like I had to be perfect all the time. She paused, looking down at her arthritis-bent fingers. When I came to America and could no longer perform, I thought my life was over. But then I realized that music had given me something more valuable than a career. It had taught me how to express my deepest feelings, how to connect with beauty, how to tell stories that mattered. What are you saying? Sarah asked. I'm saying that the most important thing is not whether you become famous or successful. The most important thing is that you stay connected to the part of yourself that can create beauty. Whether you do that at Eastman or here or anywhere else, that's up to you. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself constantly thinking about her choices. She went to work at the cafeteria, but Maria noticed that she seemed distracted. You've been different since the recital, Maria observed during their break. People are talking about how amazing you were. That's part of the problem, Sarah said. Now everyone expects me to be amazing all the time. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Maria suggested. Maybe it's time for people to see who you really are. Sarah also noticed that her classes felt different now. In music theory, Professor Martinez called on her more often and her classmates listened more carefully when she spoke. Some of them had started asking her for help with their own musical studies. During one class discussion about interpretation in classical music, Jennifer raised her hand and said, Sarah, how did you learn to make Chopin sound so emotional? When I play classical pieces, they just sound like notes to me. Sarah thought about how to answer. I think you have to understand what the composer was feeling when they wrote the piece. Chopin wrote that ballade when he was homesick and couldn't return to his country. So the music is about longing for something you can't have. But how do you make your playing express that? Asked Michael. You have to find something in your own life that feels similar, Sarah explained. Maybe you've never been homesick for a country, but maybe you've missed a person or a time in your life when things were different. You use that feeling to understand what the composer wanted to say. Professor Martinez smiled approvingly. That's exactly right, Sarah. Music is a language of emotions, not just notes. After class, Ashley approached Sarah in the hallway. I owe you an apology, she said. I said some things about you earlier in the semester that weren't very nice. I didn't know. I didn't understand that you were so talented. Sarah felt uncomfortable. You don't need to apologize. I was hiding what I could do, but why? Ashley asked. If I could play like you, I'd want everyone to know. Sarah thought about how to explain. Sometimes when you've lost something important, it's easier to pretend it never existed than to risk losing it again. A week later, Sarah made her decision. She called Dr. Harper at Eastman and asked if she could defer the scholarship offer for 1 year. I want to finish my undergraduate degree here first, she explained. And I want to take the teaching assistant position Professor Martinez offered me. I think I need to understand my own musical education better before I'm ready for graduate school. Dr. Harper was understanding. That shows wisdom, she said. The offer will still be available next year. Sarah also made another decision. She asked Professor Martinez if she could perform at the next student recital in the spring. "Of course," he said. "What would you like to play?" "Something my grandmother taught me when I was little," Sarah said. "Something that reminds me why I fell in love with music in the first place." The following semester, Sarah began her work as a teaching assistant. She helped other students with their practice techniques and musical interpretation. She discovered that she loved teaching almost as much as she loved performing. One of her students was a shy boy named David who reminded her of herself, talented but afraid to let anyone see his abilities. "The most important thing," Sarah told him during one of their lessons, "is not to play perfectly, it's to play honestly. Let people hear what the music means to you." On weekends, Sarah continued her late-night practice sessions in the music building. But now she was no longer hiding. Mr. Jackson, the janitor, had told other staff members about the talented student who practiced after hours, and several faculty members had started leaving practice room keys available for her. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the music building after a long practice session, she found Professor Martinez waiting for her. "Sarah," he said, "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me why I became a music teacher in the first place. Watching you discover your own abilities has reminded me how powerful music can be in someone's life." Sarah smiled. "Professor Martinez, can I ask you something? When you assigned me that Chopin piece, did you really think I could learn it?" He laughed. "Honestly, I thought it would be a good challenge that might motivate you to work harder. I had no idea you were capable of what you showed us. But I'm glad I was wrong." As Sarah walked home that night, she thought about all the changes in her life over the past few months. She was still the same person who worked in the cafeteria and lived in a small apartment with her grandmother. But she was also someone who had found her way back to a part of herself she thought was lost forever. When she got home, her grandmother was sitting by the piano, which no longer had a sheet covering it. Sheet music was spread out on the music stand, pieces they had been working on together. "How was practice tonight?" her grandmother asked. "Good," Sarah said. "I was working on that piece you suggested, the one you used to play in your concerts in Shanghai." Her grandmother's eyes lit up. And I think I'm starting to understand what you meant when you said that some music can only be learned when you're ready to hear what it has to teach you." Sarah sat down at the piano and began to play. The music filled their small apartment, carrying with it all the hopes and dreams and possibilities that had seemed impossible just a few months before. Outside their window, the city continued its busy life, full of people pursuing their own dreams and facing their own challenges. But inside their apartment, grandmother and granddaughter sat together in the glow of the piano lamp, connected by music that bridged generations and cultures and the countless small decisions that shape a life. Sarah had learned that sometimes the most important discoveries happen